everyone, it's Krista from K Talks, and this is another episode of my series, Coffee with Coaches, and I've got my Sassy mug. So this is my special favorite mug from my Sassy brand. Oh my goodness, and I am dealing with the Wonder Woman, Louise Reid, and she is a wonderful fellow podcaster and coach. So welcome to my show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Krista. I can't wait to jump into this.
Great. So the purpose of these series of videos is to really go into what is coaching. And so the first question I want to know is, how did you get into coaching?
Well, that's a bit of a long story. To put it in short form, really, it's a series of events that, when I look back through my life, that all together kind of got put into a blender. And so I'm referring to, my accidental education and degree in biology, followed by, studying something else that I was more passionate about, but was like voodoo at the time. Back in 1996, it was wellness. And realizing that, having some insight through that to what my path was going to be to do with people, but that's pretty vague. So I had a career in human resources, and through that got into coaching and leadership development, and knew that I wanted to be making a greater impact, knew that I wanted to be doing it with a certain kind of person. So I really was clear on my niche. And when the time was right for me to exit corporate, I just, hindsight's, you can connect the dots looking backwards. So it was kind of putting all of these pieces in combination with my life experience. And I just knew that was the time to venture out into the field of coaching. So really it was my education, life experience, and work experience that all created this magic.
Well, that's fascinating, because you talked about like 1996. You look so young. I mean, I'm like, what in high school or?
That's kind of.
Honestly, though, coaching is such a new profession, and I am so thrilled for the younger generation that they will grow up thinking that mental health is actually not a stigma topic, that you can talk about having depression, you can seek counsel, because I think that until recently, I didn't know what a coach was. For me, a coach was an athletic coach,
right?
Like a personal trainer, and or like maybe a public speaking coach. I've heard of those, but I would never think that a regular person would ever have a coach. So, this whole coaching thing opened up to me later than I would have liked. I would have loved to have a coach for most of the first half of my adult life.
I echo that, though.
Yeah.
I don't really think, I thought of coaching beyond something specific, like you just said, beyond like a career coach or sports coach or something really, really specific. I'd never really thought of it beyond that, really, until I was 40. So to your point, it's a pretty new thing, and I still think it's gaining momentum and teeth.
Well, coaching has a lot to do with self-awareness. Yeah. And I think the first part of our careers, often when we come out of college, is focused on performance. Mm-hmm. It's all focused on the external things that we have to learn and demonstrate. And very little time and discussion is wasted on what's happening inside you. Mm-hmm. So maybe it takes up until you're 40 to figure out that you should be thinking about your mindset and what's holding you back. And an author, Carol Dweck, what is her name? From Mindset. There we go. There, I always get her name wrong. Dweck. Carol Dweck really brought mindset to the mainstream and how important it is. So hopefully people won't have to wait until they're 40 to figure out that coaching is so important, whether you're working with someone or you learn to self-coach as well a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think my hope is that as coaching is gaining momentum, that those adults who are being coached have conversations with youth, whether it's, their own children or nieces, nephews, other kids in their life, to kind of create other avenues for conversations to be having this discussion earlier in their life. I know my poor kids, I feel bad because, my partner Jay, he's a coach as well. So our kids have two coaches as parents. So bless their hearts. But hopefully that will, that will spur different conversations and thinking than perhaps I had at their age.
That is so interesting you say that, because I am a mom of 4, and so 2 teens, 1 middle schooler, and 1 baby. And I'm just thinking the same. I think that a lot of my mindset issues personally originated in my upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
Bless my parents' hearts. I don't want to discredit, because they did the best they could.
Yeah.
But society in general is very performance driven and approval driven. So being good, being bad, and
Mm-hmm.
we associate winning with love. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we know that if we win, we'll get all the approval in the world. But what if you're not so good? What if you can't win? What if you're not number 1 in academics or not number 1 in athletics? Then a lot of times we feel that's tied into our value as a human being. And so whether our parents know it or not, saying good job all the time, over and over, and saying, let me look at your grades, and maybe even getting punished for not being number 1 in some families, is so harmful, because later on in adult life, we feel that everything is tied into performing outwardly for other
Yeah.
people to get the claps, to get the likes, to get the approvals. And we carry that over, not only in our personal relationships, but in our jobs. And suddenly we're like, well, why am I not happy? Suddenly you wake up and you're like, well, I've been doing everything for everyone else this
Mm-hmm.
whole time, right?
Yep.
So it's very powerful that coaching can unravel all of that. But that's another thing I wanted to ask you is, there seems to be a misconception or question around what is good coaching. People get confused between mentoring, consulting, coaching. So when I ask, so what do you do as a coach? What would be your definition in a nutshell of coaching?
I help you see, I help you hold the mirror up to yourself and see what you cannot see. So I help you shine the spotlight on the hidden corners of your inner working, right, that are stopping you from getting what it is that you want in your life. That's what I think coaching is.
That's really powerful, because we have our lovely imposter syndrome. So we can put up so many facades, and
Yeah.
we can play the role if at work or even with our partners. Sometimes I see people being very fake with their own partner, and inside you can't hide from yourself. But we do such a great job of trying, don't we?
Oh my God. I mean, there are tons and tons of self-help books written on that, right? That we numb to prevent being hurt, right? It's a very human response. We don't want to be shamed, and we don't want to look silly in the eyes of others. And so we put up facades, and we start doing that at a really young age too. Everything really does go back to our upbringing and our culture. And again, I'm not a parent shamer, and I have no issues either with my upbringing, but that's where things start. That's how we start to create stories in our minds about and make sense of our world. And we don't realize that those stories along the way at some point may not be serving us.
Or there may be a contradiction in the story, because maybe we're telling our kids we love them unconditionally, but then we're tying all of our praise and attention on their performance. So if we're constantly only giving them attention when they win, or when they have some successes, outward successes, that are meaningful in society, then it feels to them like they have to keep doing that in order to be loved and accepted. And they grow
Yeah.
up that way. So it gets pretty bad. And
One of my favorite things I say to my kids, and I feel like I'm kind of giving myself a pat on the back here, which wasn't really meaning to come out this way. But I asked them why, most of when they were little, because they're all teenagers now, but why do I love you? And they'd say, and they knew the answer at this point, because I'd say it all the time. And they'd smile, and they'd say, why? And I said, because you're you. And it was just like this, oh, I mean, so it sounds really cheesy, but to your point, I will have, messed up along the way, we all do. But that was really, and still is really important to me, that you are worthy because you exist. That is enough.
That is so beautiful. And that reminds me of a love letter I wrote to my partner, that I love his flaws.
Yeah.
And I said, there's so many good things about you, but I actually love the bad things.
Yeah.
Those are the things that maybe you don't realize that I love about you. I love that you're not perfect, and it's so important to give ourselves permission. I just watched the Brene Brown special last Easter weekend here in the States. I don't know, in Canada, do you have it or no?
We do, and I've not watched it yet, and I can't believe it because I'm like a massive Brene Brown fan.
Don't worry, I'm going to be completely honest. I did not watch the whole thing.
Okay.
And because like you, I'm busy and I have family, and but I watched enough to really reinforce the problems that we have in society with shame. And coaching is so tied to undoing the shame and giving yourself permission to fail and to fear and to be human, ultimately, not to be a perfect version of yourself, which doesn't exist. So that's Brene Brown is so, just like Carol Dweck. That's another name of a person who's really brought coaching, I think, back to the mainstream, like what we coaches are trying to do out in the world, right?
Yeah.
So, and parenting, it's interesting you brought that up because I hadn't thought about having two coaches in the house for that.
Yeah.
So that's another thing, is like, we know that a lot of this originates in childhood, but how do you parent to prevent that? I mean, like I said, I thought my parents did the best that they knew how, but how can we change the dialogue? I mean, what you said to your kids is very powerful. Do you have any other tips for parents, how we can approach helping build the right self-confident human being?
There's a couple of things. One thing that comes to mind is the difference between self-confidence and self-esteem. So I'm sharing a concept here from someone who was on my radio show. Oh my gosh, and bless her, I've forgotten her name. This is terrible. Anyway, she was explaining the difference between the two and how important it is to build self-esteem in our kids.
Mm-hmm.
So self-esteem, she was explaining, is like the bottom of the ocean. Self-confidence is like the top of the ocean. So you can imagine when there's a storm and we get big waves and stuff, the top of the ocean is like is wavy and messy and unsettled, but the bottom of the ocean remains calm, still the same, right? Unless there's like a massive tsunami or something that would disturb the bottom. So she was explaining, so what we do in our daily life with our kids is we want to build strong self-esteem so that when they go into new situations, their confidence might be rocked. So that might be like having a storm, right? So the top of the ocean, they go to a new class, they start a new sport, that their confidence might get shaken. The waves might get a bit bigger, but at the end of the day, they can look in the mirror and say to themselves, and this is about self-confidence, is I am worthy, I am enough. And so I really liked that difference between the two. And I know I'm not really answering your question in terms of, well, how do you do that?
No, that's beautiful.
I thought that was a really important distinction.
Yeah, I mean, to build strong self-esteem, and it's really goes down to your values as a
absolutely
human being. I am worthy, I am enough. That's something that we can never tell ourselves enough.
No.
And a lot of times we don't even realize that we're saying all these mean things to ourselves, or that we don't really believe we're good enough. But coaching can unravel that, and all
it can. And so when your kids say things that are self-defeating, so they sound like the things that you might say to yourself, which a lot of people actually don't even hear that voice, but is to not say, no, you're not those things. Ask them where that comes from. Like, I think it's really important to, instead of tell our kids what they should think, do, and say and act, is uncover and explore and be curious about who they are, why they say the things they do, and how they show up the way that they do. Curiosity is amazing. And we teach curiosity out of our kids, I think, because we put up this rigorous way of having to show up in a certain way, behave certain ways in certain situations. And some of those cultural norms, I think, are good to sort of maintain, but where does an individuality get suppressed and squashed, so that you just take the right action and achieve the stuff that society expects of you, instead of going like under the surface? So whether it's the iceberg model that you're thinking about, right, where you actually are examining Who are you? Like, what lights you up? What fuels your soul? What things are important to you? I've got a 15-year-old who he's had a girlfriend, the same girlfriend, for about a year and a half. And one of the, which I thought was it's really young to met someone and be with them still. But one of the things that I've noticed is that, we've had conversations over the last year and a half, the things that make him him. I said, Liam, what makes Liam Liam? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I love my sport. Because he plays hockey. I love my friends. And, we have a little bit of a conversation about that. And I said, it doesn't matter then, whoever is in your life, they cannot take those things away from you. That's you. And if they start to take those things away from you, they're chipping at who you are. And so I think it's really easy to start having these conversations. To your point at the beginning, of the podcast, you were mentioning how we are so achievement focused, action and achievement focused.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so if we just start being curious with our kids about those other things that aren't necessarily action and achievement focused, you'd be surprised with what you learn and what they can explore in their own self.
Or why do you love something? Is it because you think that you have to, because everyone around you and you want to please those people? Or is it really internal that you actually love something just for the sake of it? That's a big differentiation. But if you put those thoughts in their mind early enough, then they'll start self-coaching, which is what we want. We want them to be self-aware and be like, is this something I value, or am I only going along with it? And if you take that later on in life as an adult, you can use that in anything, with being in a relationship with someone or working with someone. And what you said was interesting too, because I think you can use that in the workplace, right? Mm-hmm. You said like having conversations about, instead of just putting ideas in your children's heads, but really taking the time to understand where those ideas are coming from. Mm-hmm. And I think, whenever we're in a position of authority, whether we're a parent or a boss, we tend to want to solve problems, right? Am I right? And we want a solution. We're just like, okay, you have a problem. I'm here. I am Wonder Woman, and I will solve your problem. Especially women, actually, we feel even more inclined to just try to solve the problem. And I think that we may completely be missing the point, right? So the point of coaching is a lot of times trying to look into things deeper, right?
Look under the hood, right? Start to peel back those layers. And the thing I've learned is that the more layers you peel back, you think that you arrive. There's always more. And it's a wonderful thing. And sometimes it's like, oh shit, really? There's more here? But yes, there is.
Well, that's another question I've definitely wanted to ask you. Since we're talking on a very deep level about emotional baggage and self-worth, I mean, those are the very core of the human soul. How do you, where's the fine line between coaching and therapy? And a lot of times I get asked, well, do you refer people to a psychiatrist at some point? Or can you as a coach take on such deep topics with them? And where do you draw the line or the boundaries?
It's a great question. And for me, it's really clear. Again, so I'll answer it from two places. One is I sort of, so I'm very, very intuitive. And so oftentimes it's just I sense it, which I know is not very helpful, which is why then I'll sort of say what the other line is, which is more of a cognitive answer. And that's looking back for the purpose of doing something differently in the future. So doing something differently now and taking different action now for a different outcome is coaching. Looking back for the purpose of having to do deep dives and healing, I think, is a therapist.
That's a very good boundary to have. I mean, there's fine line when you feel like, okay, this is the reason you are where you are now, and we can't move to where you need to be is something in your past. I mean, that's pretty standard, right? I mean, we're all carrying this baggage. And do you think it can be a teamwork effort? I mean, do you think you can continue coaching a person and say, okay, I'm going to continue coaching you, but you need therapy? Or do you ever have to draw the line and say, I can't really work with you until you've dealt with that, because I can tell it's way too heavy?
I've done both. I've done both. And for me, it came down to the one person who I said, I think we need to pause coaching, that it was this particular thing was so heavy and so deep, it was hindering her ability to move forward in any kind of productive way. There's someone else that I'm currently working with who it's a thing, and it definitely is a thing that needs to get addressed, but it's relatively isolated in terms of how it really seems to be, it doesn't seem as pervasive. And her ability to still sort of be resilient throughout it, throughout the counseling as well as our coaching, she's not overwhelmed by it, right? So I think it comes down to a really individual thing, and I think it's the responsibility of the professional being us as a coach as well as the therapist, to be able to have those kinds of honest conversations. If you are coming from a place of service, instead of a place of selling and money, although, you know, I'm doing this as my career, which means I make money, but I'm coming at it first and foremost from a place of service.
No, absolutely. I just had a call with someone prior to this, and I said, now that I know better what you need, I'm going to write up a list of 4 people who I'm going to refer you to. And I think these are the right people for you. And I'm not turning you away. You can come to me anytime, but I honestly don't want to just take your money when I see that these people would deal with that isolated specialty need that you have better. So, you know, that's where we come from, a place of service. I totally relate. One thing about emotional issues though in coaching is, isn't it a little bit like a permanent chronic illness that, like, there's this underlying baggage that you think you've shed, like maybe you had some trauma, but for your whole life, honestly, that's just becomes part of your identity. And so there's flare-ups. Would you agree with that?
I think I'm not, maybe it's just semantics. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily call it maybe it is a flare-up. I think that when we can shine the spotlight of these dark places of our soul and the dark spots of our, you know, our life experience, and look at it with an awareness of it happened, as opposed to having feelings of guilt, shame, and we're trying to stop the feelings from rising, then I think there can be flare-ups. I think that when we can look at those situations, and I'm generalizing here, right? So I realize that there's a huge continuum of traumas that people experience. So I don't want to be belittling some really significant traumas here. So, but just generally speaking, I think people have overcome some traumas that make me weep beyond what I can even imagine. And yet they have found peace in that. And so, yes, they remember it. And if something reminds them of it, you know, they see someone, they go to a place, or they get a smell, they can be reminded of it without there being a flare-up. That they just notice. They notice and they observe, and then they carry on. And this speaks to the importance of mindfulness. I'm totally passionate about mindfulness, and meditation is a form of mindfulness. But when we can actually allow ourselves to sense what's going on in our mind and our bodies and recognize it without judgment, and then just let it pass, it is so freeing when you can live like that. And so that's, you know, it speaks to what you were sort of saying in terms of flare-ups. I think it's possible to heal from that.
That is beautiful. And it reminds me of something that my midwife told me about being in labor when I was delivering my baby. She said, you know, if you fight pain, you will not win. Mm-hmm. If you observe it from a distance and you decide to be curious and approach it from a sense of curiosity, you won't feel it. And she actually taught me some meditation and visualization techniques. And when I felt myself going into labor, she said, you feel it? Describe it. And now let's turn it into a ball of light and power. Mm-hmm. And let's pretend that you're in the ocean and it's a big wave coming. Those are the contractions. It's a wave. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to paddle against the wave and use all your force and energy to stop? She's like, you're not going to stop the wave. Have you ever seen a human on the shore stop a wave? Right? We're not parting the Red Sea here. You're going to have the baby. So, and I love that, because I actually have applied that to my mindset. And I think, okay, there's these huge forces of pain and suffering that come from deep-rooted trauma, and I can't stop that. I can't undo the things that are happening, and it's deeply unfair and deeply hurtful what's happening. But it's like what she described: observe it from a place of curiosity, and now be really into that self-awareness and describing how it feels. And as long as you can keep that distance, it can't touch you. You know, you're in a safe place. You're near it, but you're not in the storm. You know, and I love
That's beautiful. That's awesome. I love that expression. I totally and completely agree with that. And I think applying that, like you said, to other aspects of our life, it's life. It really is life changing.
It really is. And coaching is the secret. I mean, we have to start with knowing how to be mindful and be self-aware of what's going on in our minds. And that brings me to the last question: is what would you want someone to know about coaching, like in terms of expectations? Someone's never worked with a coach and they listen to this and they're like, wow, this all sounds so fascinating. A little bit scary, but fascinating nevertheless. Is there like a magic wand that we can just work with a person and wave and they're like, they have a positive mindset, all of a sudden they're never negative again? Do we have superpowers as coaches, or is like
my Wonder Woman cup is just God to make me feel strong. And no, there's no magic wand. And I think it's a really great question. We go into everything in life with expectations, don't we? We go into motherhood with expectations. And I don't know about you, it is more amazing and more difficult than I ever imagined. It's both, right? So coaching is the same thing. So in terms of expectations, I think you have to be just extremely curious and open-minded. And open-minded to the fact that others, your coach, will see things that you don't see yourself. And that's what I was saying sort of, a number of minutes ago. And that's where the power and the magic is, that you're hiring someone to support you in getting to places you've never been able to get to on your own. So be ready to shine the light on those shadows. And you are going to feel uncomfortable. Absolutely be prepared to feel uncomfortable and to feel challenged, to feel sick. And you will never get used to that. But when you have those feelings, to know that it is normal, and it means that you are, I like to think of it as sort of you're taking a puzzle apart. The puzzle that was once your life that you knew what the picture was, you're now taking the puzzle apart and you're in the process of making a new puzzle. And so there's going to be new pieces and it's more painful and it's being created, right? And so with that comes a level of discomfort that you will never get comfortable with.
Lisa Nichols, who's a famous motivational speaker, she said that in order for her to transform into this new positive person, she actually had to die. And she said, I didn't physically die, but I let my old personality die. I let a lot of my old relationships die. There was a narrow doorway that I needed to squeeze through, and there wasn't room for anyone else. I had to first cross by myself, and later on I could pull people through that doorway. But I loved how she described that as dying, because in a way it's a rebirth, a lightness, a transformation for sure, if you find the right coach. So that's one of the reasons I'm doing this video series, to wrap it up, is to let people in on a taste of different personalities, because by seeing someone on video, by listening to them on audio, you get a sense of their coaching style. And I would caution anyone listening or watching to take the time to hire a coach, because it is a two-way street and you need to find the right style. So Louise has a podcast, very good podcast. She's also very active on social media, posting her nuggets of wisdom regularly. And that's a good way to figure out if she might be the right coach for you, or someone you love dearly who needs that support.
And if I can add to that, first of all, thank you. And if I can add to that, you should be able to interview coaches, speak to them beforehand. And if they won't give you some free time to find out if they're a good match for you, I'm telling you now, they are not a good match for you. You should have some free time to identify if that would be someone who you would connect with, because it's a relationship. right? It's a relationship and someone you have to have a connection with and trust in.
That's true. And also maybe to find out what their working process is. So recently I've discovered that coaches have vastly different working processes. I recently spoke with a coach who will only do Facebook chat voicemail. And like, you know, you're hiring me, you're paying the same price as we would pay for another coach, but that's my way of working. I don't talk to you directly. So I leave you a voicemail, then you respond via voicemail, and everything happens on Facebook Messenger. And so there's no live video calls or phone calls. And for some person that might be cool. Like, oh wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
For another person that might not work because you're
Yeah.
sharing such intimate, like deep stuff. You want to have eye contact, whether, you know, you can be with them in person or remotely, you still want to have eye contact. So that's another thing to ask a coach, right? Is what does coaching session look like if I hire you?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think just being able to talk about as well what your goals are and how would you go about, you know, high level, how would you go about helping me achieve that? I
Lovely.
think those are fair questions to ask.
Lovely. Well, Louise, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I'm sure we could talk all day about parenting and the
Sure we
soul,
could.
but I'm sure you have stuff to do. It's a lovely Friday, and I thank you again for being on my show. And let's talk soon. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much, Krista.